Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the final trio of lectures this afternoon in BASES 2023 Christmas seminars. Here's Lucy.
Thank you, Miles. Thank you very much. So I'm going to dive quite deep. This is a historical. I'm going to look at historical examples of mechanisms at work. I want to show how science has been used as a form of social political control, how it has been weaponized as part of the battle for our minds. This use of science is especially relevant now, as we are told that we live in a world of crisis and that we humans are killing the planet. So what I'm going to discuss are the historical roots for this doom-laden message, which goes back more than 500 years. So we've been programmed for a long time to believe in the science of doom. But as I hope I can show, we can break free of the programming and know that there is an alternative scientific view of life on Earth, which has survived all attempts to suppress it. So I'm indebted to the American historian Webster Tarpley, and a Canadian writer and thinker, Matthew Ehret, English author William Stewart, and a project called 21st Century for much of what follows. And I can provide links to all their works. So science as a mind control mechanism works brilliantly. Only a scientist can challenge a scientist, and then only one of superior standing. That much is obvious. So we saw that with COVID. Dr. Fauci, I am the science. It is, however, worse than that. The very subject matter itself may have been distorted over the centuries in order to support another agenda, a form of counter-mimicry. It is crazy how we are accused of spreading conspiracy theories and subjected to threats of disinformation, misinformation, when the original disinformation has actually been dished out to us over the centuries. Thus, fundamental stuff that we take for granted, ways of explaining the world through physics, may not actually be correct. A perfect example of what the dominant mindset has created for us since at least the late 16th century as part of its doom cult is the second law of thermodynamics. It's just one example, entropy. This is a principle which, when applied to cosmology, implies that we live in a state of disorder where everything degenerates, a dying and dead cosmos. And we can now supposedly add the role of humans in hastening planetary demise. So before I go into more detail about the science, I want to give you some idea about who, how, and why, so that you can get a better idea about motive. Using this hackneyed symbol of the pyramid, because it is a pyramidical structure, I'm going to look at why first. So you could be forgiven for thinking that the main motive for the abuse of science is power and wealth. That we were told the COVID lies, follow the science, lockdown, deprived of our liberty in 2020, frightened into taking an experimental medical procedure in 21, so that billionaires could get richer and big pharma could make massive profits. Undoubtedly, that may be what happened and may even have been part of the motive. There is, however, another aspect of dictatorship, of oligarchs, of power and wealth, and that is the use of power and wealth to control people so that those at the top can consume resources, all resources. I'm talking here of the pure evil of human trafficking as one of those resources. We could also call it the slave trade. It's more than slavery. I'm not going to go into any detail. You can fill in the blanks for yourself. But just know that in my view, this is what is the fundamental driver of this whole thing. So once you understand the need to acquire resources, it becomes so obvious why free trade is so important, why these people are globalists, why they want to create empires, or in modern times, international bodies like the UN or the European Union, why they don't want tariffs or any barriers to the free flow of goods, regardless of what those goods might be. In their world, the end justifies the means. They will acquire those resources by fair means or foul. War, trade makes no difference. In fact, war makes it easier for them because their prey becomes more available and people are displaced. So who are these people? Unfortunately for us, they are to some extent a many-headed hydra. You know them mainly by their deeds and the fact that they support each other, forming secret societies, committees, and they go by many names. Khazarian Mafia, Deep State, Committee of 300, Council on Foreign Relations. This may be one occasion when pronouns are appropriate, and we can just call them them. We can also refer to the general collective as the mind virus. Now, it's interesting to note at this point that Elon Musk has also identified a mind virus, which he associates with extinctionists, with a doom cult. Having said that, it is possible to track specific groups when looking into the history of science, and it may surprise you to know that the roots of this modern abuse of science originated in Venice in the 16th century. And that Venice at that time was run by families who had come from Rome 1,000 years earlier. The Roman connection is very relevant. After the fall of Rome in 476 AD, certain powerful families left and relocated to Venice, where they created a new city-state. In Venice, they were relatively safe from attack in the middle of mosquito-infected lagoons. The significance of having come from Rome is that they retained a principle of loyalty to a city-state, a very Roman characteristic. Only now it was Venice, not Rome. All could be justified in the name of the interests of a city-state. Religion for them was just a power play. The survival of the city was more important than any religion. These Venetians retained other psychopathic Roman traits, such as being without empathy, being soulless, in fact, atheists, able to play both sides for material gain. A particular modus operandi of the Venetian was the use of blackmail, assassination, espionage. And the Venetians, having lost the Roman Empire and so easy access to resources, then had to build strong trading networks instead. As a result, they became extremely wealthy, sponsoring the Crusades in the 12th century and generally developing trade with the Levant, Eastern Mediterranean. They consistently kept their power intact for 1,000 years through groups of dynastic families who formed a ruling committee with an inner circle and a doge. Hence, they could think long-term. Their trade interests had to be protected at all costs, even if that meant developing new operational bases away from Venice. So when in the early 16th century, the Venetians faced a major attack on them from other Europeans in the form of the 1508 League of Cambrai, the other Europeans having got fed up with the Venetians' way of operating, the Venetians decided to ingratiate themselves with a young King Henry VIII, the newly arrived king on the throne of England, who had not joined in the league against Venice. It was then that the Venetians began to establish a footing here in England. Given that religion was just a power play for them, they could as easily support Protestantism if that suited their interests. And they were able to help Henry, for example, by using the Venetian-controlled University of Padua to develop the arguments with the Pope that supported his divorce in 1527. So it's not surprising that the Venetians were still a presence in England when Henry VIII's daughter, Elizabeth I, decided in 1600 to sponsor the creation of the East India Company, which went on to become the world's most powerful trading entity for more than 200 years, dealing in all sorts of resources, including opium. While the Tudors and then the Stuarts were useful to the Venetian influence, especially through entities like the East India Company, the Venetians did not, however, have the kind of control over the British that they would have liked. The Stuarts in particular were troublesome with their belief in divine right of kings, which is not how the Venetians viewed the role of monarchy. It wasn't until 1688 and the Glorious Revolution that they managed to install their man on the throne of England, James II having been forced to flee after only 3 years on the throne. So William of Orange then became King of England in effectively a bloodless coup. He was more amenable to ruling like a Venetian doge, which can be compared to being like a managing director the Venetian doges being elected by their noble families to represent them. From 1688 onwards, William was answerable to the oligarchs who controlled the British Parliament at the time. Even the Bill of Rights that they passed in 1689 suited those oligarchs in Parliament. And it was only 5 years after that that Venetians were able to help with the establishment in 1694 of the Bank of England, which started as a private bank, no doubt modelled on the Fondi of Venice. Ever wondered why Lombard Street? Does anybody know what these letters stand for? Pounds, shillings and pence? They actually stand for, the pound is lira, the S is soldi, and the D is denari. Not pounds, shillings and pence at all. But we just look at that and think of pounds, shillings and pence. That just goes to show you how deep this influence of the Venetians is. Now, all of this political background is important to bear in mind when considering the development of science, because it explains motive and context. From 1688 onwards, the Venetians were able to have an even more powerful influence on British scientists and thinkers. So why the interest in science? Weren't these people just money people, just concerned about trade, free flow of goods, the original bankers, people who MO, espionage, blackmail, assassination? Understanding this point is crucial to the realization that the motive is about more than power and wealth, and that bankers are themselves puppets in the upper echelon, but still puppets. That's why not all bankers are bad. So why science? Now, for some reason, the Venetians must have worked out that science is a useful psychological tool. Not only does science form opinions, but it actually shapes the way that people see the world. This need to frame the narrative is a key characteristic of the mind virus. Another characteristic of the mind virus is that it spots trends that could challenge it and then works out ways to infiltrate them so it can steer a trend in its direction. The language of science is a powerful way to manipulate trends and lend legitimacy to socio-political policies, which form the basis for oppression and control. Arch-globalist Sir Julian Huxley gave the game away when he stated 70 years ago in his 1953 book, Evolution in Action. He said, "Science has two functions, comprehension and control." And it was Sir Julian who helped set up UNESCO and became founder of the Worldwide Fund for Nature, along with Prince Philip. He was definitely a globalist. And we have just lived through a perfect example of how science can be used and abused with the COVID crisis. Their need to control people, subjugate them either physically or psychically, and preferably psychically, because that's so much more effective and less expensive, so that they can see what they have deliberately created. It's much easier for them. And what they wanted to create was a death cult. Now, if you are part of a death cult, you are more likely to accept isolation and separation from people and planet. It's then easier for them to exploit you as a resource, and harder for you to resist them if they dress it up in scientific terms. And it is this death cult which still has a grip on us today. So it is critical that we know more about it, and about the more positive, life-affirming counter-narrative, which has largely been suppressed since at least the 17th century, which is why this historical background is so important. What hasn't been obvious to us are the extreme lengths that the mind virus is prepared to go, to the extent that science we take for granted appears to have the dead hand of the Venetians on it, and for that reason isn't necessarily correct. And we are still living with the consequences of what the Venetians started over 500 years ago. It wasn't until near the end of the 16th century that the Venetians even began to develop the slightest interest in science. Until the late 1500s, the Venetians had no time for it. They preferred the dark arts. But it was during the late 1500s that people started to take more of an interest in physics in general, and the cosmos in particular, mainly because of advances in telescopes. More was being discovered about the cosmos, and the ideas of Kepler and later Leibniz were gaining popularity in European courts. But for reasons which will become clear, these discoveries were not to the liking of the Venetians. Infiltrating science thus became essential to them. So if they wanted to control the science narrative in order to counter Leibniz and Kepler, they needed to have their own man. And interestingly, the person they initially sponsored was Galileo Galilei, who was teaching mathematics at the end of the 16th century at the Venetian-controlled University of Padua. By 1609, Galileo was demonstrating his telescope to the Venetian Senate. He was very much their man. But unfortunately for the Venetians, they seem to have lost control over him to the Roman Papal Inquisition towards the end of his life, when he was placed under house arrest. The principle was nevertheless established, and up until that point, they had him as their front man for shaping science in the direction they wanted. And from this point onwards, it starts to become clear exactly what they meant by science and how it could be manipulated. And with the help of, over time, of the British and some elements in France and Switzerland. And where the Venetians started was with selected beliefs of Aristotle, who was generally popular with early Christians and universities at the time. The ancient Greek philosopher, he was useful to the Venetians because he gave respectability to views on slavery, for example. He believed that from the hour of their birth, some are marked for subjection and others for rule, i.e. intended by nature to be slaves. So according to Aristotle, the virtue of the master could not be the same as the virtue of the slave, relative values. And given, in his view, that we are blank slates, we can be programmed. This is the utilitarian view of humans, in which the human mind is governed only by our five senses and our immediate experiences. There is no universal mind in Aristotle's worldview. Logic is all that matters. So in contrast with Aristotle, what the Venetians did not want to encourage were the beliefs of Plato. This is the image that in the Vatican that Raphael painted of them. Plato on the left and Aristotle on the right. And what writer Matthew Ehret points out is that Plato is painted in motion, whereas Aristotle is static, he stood in place. And that reflects Aristotle's cosmology, a static, uncreative universe. And key differences between them are that Plato believed in an eternal, immortal soul and in universal values. Freedom versus slavery. And if we are to bring these contrasting views up to date, how they have evolved into the modern era, this is how I would characterize the death cult in comparison with life. So you have this idea of the Big Bang, a dying universe, it's all disorder, random, life as a race, it's linear progress, individual atoms, it's about lack, there's never enough of anything, and it's fundamentally misanthropic. It hates humans. And this is how I would contrast the other side. Eternal life, harmony and purpose, life as a dance, cycles of time, interconnected networks, abundance. There's plenty of everything. There's plenty of fossil fuel. There's plenty of it all. It's philanthropic. It's pro-humans. So why were astronomers Johannes Kepler and Gottfried Leibniz such an anathema to the Venetians in the late 16th and 17th century? It was precisely because they challenged Aristotle with their revival of Plato and of Pythagoras. Most notably, Kepler's 1619 work, Harmonies of the World. What Kepler worked out is that same harmonic proportions of visual and audible space, as expressed in the golden section, the 5 Platonic solids, and the divisions of a string into proportion, generate the same intervals that organize the intervals of the planets in the solar system. This is Pythagoras' music of the spheres. Take the planet Venus as an example. In 8 Earth years, there are 13 Venus years. This is the Fibonacci series. And the pattern that they make as they travel around the sun is 5-fold. This is all, and if you cut an apple in half, you have to cut it horizontally, not vertically. The fruit associated with Venice, you find a pentagram. Now, with the death of Kepler in 1630, the Venetians must have thought that was the end of the threat from him. Galileo outlived Kepler, But then only a few decades after the death of Galileo in 1642, another brilliant mind began to emerge in Europe, further developing the ideas of Kepler. This is Gottfried Leibniz. He was an extraordinary polymath, mathematician and scientist. He tried to encourage various European monarchs to take up Plato's concept of the benign philosopher king. He exchanged ideas with Chinese scholars and had a particular interest in Confucian notions of harmony and natural law. He was inspired by the I Ching and apparently invented a binary language which forms the basis of modern computing. Most of all, he carried on the work of Kepler in exploring geometries as fundamental to explaining how the universe works. Leibniz proposed that nature, when left free to express itself, operated according to fundamental economy that resulted in the most action for the least effort. This is the minimum-maximum principle. According to Leibniz, the movement of planets could be explained not by their mass or the shape of an ellipse, but because of this geometric minimum-maximum principle. He is also known for being one of the inventors of calculus, and Leibniz's explanation for planetary motion was in direct contrast to the theories of the other inventor of calculus, Sir Isaac Newton. This is when the story gets really interesting and why you needed the rest of that background. Newton was of great relevance to the Venetians and their science-based death cult because of his belief in a dying and empty universe with objects floating around in it, relying on clockwork, moved by invisible forces of attraction. In this Newtonian universe, there is no purpose, only empirical logic bounded by our five senses, this Aristotelian view. And the idea of the dying universe is the ground laid later for concepts of entropy. Now, the Venetians could see how these philosophical scientific concepts could be made to apply to humans. If space is empty with objects floating around like clockwork, moved by forces of attraction, the same can be applied to human society. We are no more than individual blobs who respond to forces of attraction, fear and greed being two of the main ones. We have no innate morality, no innate creativity, because according to Aristotle, we're born as blank slates. And it wasn't just Newton, but also Newton's contemporaries, such as John Locke, who worked alongside Newton at the Royal Mint, who promoted this soulless concept of humans as blank slates. Locke explicitly echoed Aristotle in his view that, this is what he said, souls of the newborn are empty tablets. In Locke's essay on human understanding, which was published in 1689, only a year after the Glorious Revolution, then he said, like Aristotle, he believed that slavery was an immutable part of the universe. A constitution that Locke wrote for the Carolinas in America described slaves as property. But just as Kepler had rejected Aristotle's blank slate, so did Leibniz. Leibniz, however, didn't write a response to John Locke until 1704, and it wasn't published until after his death in 1716. But by this time, the Venetians had delivered the coup de grace. They needed Leibniz's influence to wane throughout Europe. They wanted him discredited. In particular, they wanted the world to know that Newton's version of calculus was correct, and for others to think that Leibniz was a fraud. And curiously, it was around 1715 that the Royal Society confirmed Newton's version, and 1715 was also when a certain Venetian agent by the name of Conti arrived in London and befriended Newton. He deliberately intervened in the controversy between Newton and Leibniz, even getting Newton to enroll him as a member of the Royal Society. He pretended to befriend both of them in order to solve the controversy, but in reality, he wanted to make sure that Newton won and that the doom cult would prevail. Because it was at this time that the British Empire was growing and the ideas of Newton, Locke, Hobbes and others were able to legitimise the activities of the ever-expanding East India Company. Of particular importance were concepts of self-interest, which were becoming popular. Pseudoscience was used to explain that individuals act in response to their own pain or pleasure without any concern for the whole, a view which found expression in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, published in 1776. He wrote about market forces, hidden hands, and an atomized society responding to fear or greed. And it wasn't long after that that the Venetians began to push the idea that there are too many of us. We have been led to believe that the notions that humans might exceed the carrying capacity of the earth originated with the Reverend Thomas Malthus, who is famous for his proposition outlined in his 1799 essay on the principal population, that agricultural production grows arithmetically while population grows logarithmically, meaning that population growth will inevitably outpace food production. But in fact, this is something you probably do not know. In fact, the Reverend Malthus was building on writings that first appeared nearly a decade earlier with a publication in 1790 of a Venetian work entitled Reflections on the Population of Nations in Relation to National Economy. Its author is described by American historian Webster Tarpley as one of the most important ideologues of the Venetian oligarchy. He was called Gianmaria Ortez. And Webster Tarpley has a whole article written about him. So while the popularity of Malthus has never declined, nearly 200 years later, his beliefs are still being promoted within the Club of Rome and 1972 limits to growth and still trotted out today. No one acknowledges the Venetian inspiration for his ideas. In the face of supposed threat of overpopulation, Malthus was in favour of culling useless eaters. He opposed poor relief being given to infants of little value to society. Those are his words. And it is only a small step from believing that there is not enough to believing that some are more deserving than others. And this is how society has developed naturally, evolved naturally. And to Charles Darwin and his theories of natural selection. Even though Charles Darwin was opposed to slavery, he was nevertheless inspired by the works of Malthus. And there are those who see Darwin's theories of evolution based on natural selection as being Malthusian. As humans outcompete each other for survival, only the fittest survive. It's another small step from observing nature making the selection as to who should survive to certain humans deciding who should be encouraged to breed and those who should not, i.e. eugenics. And it's no coincidence that it's Darwin's cousin, Sir Francis Galton, who was the founder of the eugenics movement. So to recap, according to them, we live in a dying and empty universe with objects floating around in it, relying on clockwork, moved by invisible forces of attraction, and the hidden hand, overpopulation. I think you've got the general idea. So if nothing else, what the Venetians taught the British is that when you can influence beliefs, you have more control over people. And science is the perfect instrument that cannot be easily challenged. Dress it up as scientific and people are trapped. As a result, so many of these unscientific beliefs have been drip-fed into us right into the 20th and 21st century, to the extent that we assume they must be correct. And we never get told about the Venetian influence. And yet these basic assumptions can all be called into question and must be called into question, even entropy. The dying universe, the second law of thermodynamics, put simply, is a principle applied to the universe based on the observation that all tends eventually to disorder, disintegration, and death. So while Newton had posited a dying universe in the 17th century, the second law of thermodynamics actually developed in the 19th century, starting in 1824, when a young engineer in the French army by the name of Nicolas Sadi-Carnot was working on steam engines, and he was interested in the maximum efficiency of heat engines. He observed that all machines can be treated as closed systems, and that a heat-powered machine will burn more energy than is created as it moves from hot to cold, and that the system dies unless more fuel is added. Pretty obvious, really. His ideas were later picked up by Rudolf Clausius and Lord Kelvin and properly developed into the second law of thermodynamics. In 1865, Rudolf Clausius published a treatise extrapolating from Carnot's work on engines that the universe is similarly a closed system, Therefore, the energy of the universe is constant and tends towards entropy. And the way physicists resolve the possible contradiction between Big Bang and entropy is to suggest that entropy was low at the time of Big Bang. It's a complete contradiction and has increased over time. But what if Big Bang theory itself is not so solid? One potential crack in the Big Bang theory are controversial ideas around redshift. The standard model of physics presumes that Big Bang occurred 13.7 billion years ago and that the universe is constantly expanding. And quasars are assumed to be evidence of this expansion because of the red colour associated with them, the velocity interpretation. Here is a picture of a quasar. NASA defines a quasar as, it's an abbreviation of the phrase quasi-stellar radio source. And it appears as a bit star-like in the sky. And according to NASA, they are immensely powerful centres of distant active galaxies powered by a huge disk of particles surrounding a massive black hole. And they're capable of emitting hundreds or thousands of times the entire output of our galaxy. They are red in colour because it is assumed they are receding from us. There is, however, another view put forward by the controversial American astronomer Holton Arp. From the 1960s onwards, he observed a different phenomenon. He didn't interpret the red colour as being an indicator of receding distance, but an indicator of age of the star-like material. He proposed that the quasars are young material which has been ejected from a parent galaxy, usually in pairs, and he was able to identify the line of axis along which the quasar material had travelled. Arp said that the reason quasars appear red in the spectrum is because as younger galaxies, they are forming with less dense matter, and so quasars are potentially much closer to us than we think. Now, my purpose for telling you all of this isn't necessarily to take you into the arcane world of astronomy or any other aspect of science, but to help you realise that when someone says, trust the science, you can know that the science is not settled and there could be other explanations and there might even be a whole other agenda behind it. And to illustrate the point that the doom cult likes to make, which is that it's all inevitable because it's scientific, nothing you can do about it. Therefore, we who make the policies that govern you have no responsibility for what happens to you, and you have to do what we tell you because we have the science and the superior knowledge. So I want to finish by talking about another 20th century scientist who was ironically adopted by the doom cult, but who had in fact rejected some of their most fundamental beliefs. This is the Russian-Ukrainian scientist Vladimir Vernadsky. Vernadsky was a prominent Russian scientist. He was born in 1864, and he spent much of his time in Ukraine, where there is, I don't know if it's still there, Science Institute named after him. He died in 1945, so his life spans the latter half of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century. He's famous in the West because he wrote about the biosphere. He published research on it in the 1920s. He didn't invent the term. That came from a geologist, Edward Zeus, in 1875. But in the 1920s, he promoted the idea that the world is an ecological closed system. And what Vernadsky said about living matter is that by weight, it comprises a minute part of the planet and that it is geologically eternal. Living matter is concentrated in a thin, more or less continuous layer in the troposphere on dry land, in fields and forests, and permeates the entire ocean. On dry land, its continuous mass reaches to a depth of probably less than 3 kilometers on average. It does not exist outside the biosphere. Now, Vernadsky's work was known about in Anglo-American academic circles before World War II and was taken up by them after the war. His son George had moved to America, where he became a professor at Yale, which helped his father's ideas become better known in the West. But the only way the doom cult could adopt Vernadsky Sr. was by ignoring certain important aspects of his work. Vernadsky believed that there are 3 main domains involving planet Earth: the lithosphere, which is basically the rocks, the biosphere, and the noosphere. It is this third category that the doom cult cannot accept. The noosphere relates to the invisible realm of human creative thought and interacts directly with the biosphere. It's a very Gnostic view, which is the role of humans is here to co-create with Earth. Vernadsky did not believe in zero growth. He was very much in favour of technological advances and wrote approvingly in the 1930s about mastery of new forms of energy, steam, electricity, radioactivity, mastery of all the chemical elements and their utilisation for the needs of man. And he completely disagreed with Malthus. He said this: Malthus doesn't realise that his fundamental results lead to entirely different conclusions. Malthus did not take into consideration that as regards food and the necessities of life, the expansion of plant and animals comprising it must inevitably increase with greater force and speed, expressing a more rapid rate of reproduction than that of the population, i.e. that agriculture will grow faster than us humans. And because humans have the creative ability to overcome apparent limits with their agricultural innovations, there is no limit to growth. And this is precisely what we have seen. The planet has no difficulty in providing for 8 billion people. And where Vernadsky also fundamentally disagreed with the doom cult was in the issue of how life on Earth started. He did not agree with the primordial soup concept. This was a popular concept with leading members of the doom cult, such as Darwin and others I haven't mentioned, like Haldane, Wells, Huxley, the grandfather to Aldous and Julian, which interestingly originate with Aristotle. It's also called abiogenesis, the notion that life came from a combination of inorganic materials, oxygen, carbon, and so on, and that these were activated by external radiation into creating life. Vernadsky said that's not possible. He said life is too complex and starts off complex. In his view, life comes from life. He was very much part of the life-affirming view of science. So to summarize the positive counter-narrative, this is the cult of life, knowing that there is a place for everything. It isn't the survival of the fittest, but the survival of what fits. All is in harmony, or can be. The earth is abundant. Oil regenerates through abiotic methods. It is those who want us to believe that humans are the problem, that are themselves the problem. They are the ones in error who have fallen under the influence of the mind virus. The Muppet puppets who are trapped in the doom cult have no idea that they've got caught up in someone else's mind warping, so twisted to the extent that they believe that plant food, as Sandi was saying, is carbon, should be eliminated, the very stuff of life. They haven't worked out that they've been set up. They haven't joined the dots. It doesn't occur to them that there's a reason why a former governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, the UN's climate czar, is on their side. Someone who on the face of it appears to have nothing in common with Just Stop Oil or some other activist muppet. It's because as an obedient member of the oligarchy class, he's following in the Venetian tradition and protecting the agenda the Muppets have swallowed hook, line and sinker. So I'm going to end with some curious images. Can anyone guess what these are? They're both. They're brain neurons and filaments of the universe. And I think they just illustrate this extraordinary fractal nature of life and how we are all interconnected. We don't need a doom cult to explain the world to us because we can see for ourselves it's all connected. And especially after the COVID crisis, we cannot allow so-called science to take away our freedoms and our common sense, and particularly the use and abuse of science to tell us how to live. The climate con has to be the last attempt of the doom cult to rule our lives. We need to break free of the doom cult and reclaim the actual truth about the physical world, following the footsteps of Kepler, Leibniz, Vernadsky and others. We owe it to those who are either mentally or literally physically trapped and enslaved by them to help our fellow humans rediscover their humanity and personal sovereignty that is the birthright of all of us, and let others know that there is an alternative body of scientific beliefs that can benefit us, because we all come from a life-affirming positive source which creates harmony and balance. Thank you.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, this is BASES 2023 Christmas seminars. It's the closing second presentation by Lucy Wyatt. Lucy, take it away. Here's Lucy.
Thank you. Thank you, Miles. Thank you. Right. So in my previous presentation, I tried to show how a mind virus uses certain psychological tricks to gain control over us, and how that mind virus worked through the Venetians to twist our understanding of science for the last 500 years to create the basis for their doom cult. I now want to briefly discuss how the mind virus has operated in the geopolitical sphere to achieve its goals, and how much of what we see today has roots going back at least 300 years or more, at times almost achieving total control of the world through the doom cult. And in my view, the good news is, from a geopolitical perspective, the doom cult, I think, is in decline. The bad news is that we here in the West are in the belly of the beast, which is why it matters, especially to us, what happens in America. But we should not lose hope. As my great-grandfather wrote to my grandmother from his hotel in Liverpool, as he and my great-grandmother were about to cross the Atlantic to the USA in June 1940, he said to her, "Whatever happens, don't allow yourself to give in spiritually. We will not give in." He said he had no intention of allowing a submarine to get them, and they survived and came back to the UK later. Now, more than ever, after the doom cult revealed itself capable of shutting down the global economy with the COVID crisis, depriving us of our freedoms, it effectively put us on a war footing, and in the process destroyed lives and livelihoods of millions of people. It is critical that we understand how the doom cult has operated historically. History reveals the goals and the tactics of the doom cult, as well as when and how it has been successfully challenged in the past. Those successful challenges of the past have laid the seeds for success today, and I'm thinking particularly here of America and of Russia. Now, when discussing geopolitics, it helps to look at maps, and particularly helpful to consider a perspective which Sir Harold Mackinder proposed in a 1904 paper to the Royal Geographical Society called The World Island. Now, from this perspective, Russia is at the heartland of the world island. Mackinder believed that this was a pivot area, and that whoever controlled the heartland controlled the world. Essentially, this is a land-based power, and he contrasted that with the outer rim, which he regarded as a maritime power, as this map shows. Britain is obviously a key maritime power. America also falls into the category of maritime for these purposes. And historically, there have been the Dutch, Spanish, and Portuguese, and others. They've all been maritime powers at one time or other. And we have had the great empires, and we've had the great empires of the past, the Roman Empire and so forth. But it was John Dee, Elizabeth I astrologer and magician, who first proposed the idea of a British empire in more modern times based on naval strength. In his General and Rare Memorials Pertaining to the Perfect Art of Navigation that he published in 1577, he explained this. Elizabeth was cautious and didn't initially pursue the idea, although settlements began to spring up on the east coast of America, Virginia being named in honor of the Virgin Queen. And she endorsed, as I said earlier, the creation of the East India Company in 1600. And this, as a reminder, is what the empire became and looked like at its height in 1915, more than 300 years later. In the meantime, Britain gained and lost colonies, most importantly on the east coast of America in the 18th century. And Churchill was still trying to defend the empire in his exchanges with FDR in 1945 toward the end of World War II. So even though the British Empire no longer technically exists, its legacy continues in so many ways. Imperialism now effectively becoming globalism. And Britain and its allies continue to be concerned about the big green blob, i.e. Russia. I'll return to the blob in a bit. First, I want to run through some top notes in terms of what has shaped geopolitics over the last 300 years or so, and the ideologies that still affect us to today. So taking the symbol of Britannia as a symbol of tyranny and the Statue of Liberty, symbol of freedom, the differences between the two sides can be summarised as followed, starting with one being pro-empire and the other sovereignty, which includes personal sovereignty. So free trade, open borders, protection, border controls, genocidal eugenics, family values, freedom of choice. These are big generalizations. I should say something here about capitalism in the sense of entrepreneurs who raise money and invest in businesses, big or small. That's how I see capitalists, people who create jobs and wealth and help the world go around. Oligarchs, on the other hand, are anti-capitalism. They profit off people and create wealth in other ways. They do not want society to thrive. They would be happy if we all became serfs again. Multinational corporations who are globalists, who disrespect national boundaries, i.e. do not pay local taxes, are just another variation of an oligarch. And this category refers to trickery, psychological trickery. In the best sense, psychiatry should be about healing the mind, although I'm aware of how it can be abused in violation of human rights. The outcome of all of this is tyranny and freedom. So going back into history, some top notes. As I said, Elizabeth I laid the foundation for globalism, imperialism through commercial activity with the creation of the East India Company in 1600. Within the next 20 years, the first African slaves started to arrive in America. Then around that time, the 30 Years' War breaks out in Europe. These were religious wars in which parts of Germany lost half its population. Maybe up to 8 million people died. Now, what is significant from the perspective of geopolitics is what happened next, after the end of the 30 Years' War. And that was the Treaty of Westphalia. This is what Europe looked like in 1648. Germany and Italy were not unified countries. The Ottoman Empire included most of southern and central Europe. The Poles controlled the Ukraine. What is now the Donbass was the Crimean Khanate. The most significant point about the Treaty of Westphalia is that it recognized the principle of the nation state. 128 clauses designed to respect the rights of others to be left alone and not impinge onto territory that doesn't belong to you. Matthew Ehret points out that what is unusual about the Treaty of Westphalia is that, number one, all nations will now be guided by concern for the benefit of their neighbours, and two, the forgiveness for all past transgressions. These are really significant points. While all of this was happening, there are 13 British colonies becoming established in America. And skipping over a lot of history, the next major development on the world stage is obviously the American War of Independence, which began in 1775, and the Declaration of Independence from the British Crown in 1776. I just want to say very briefly about some thing in political philosophy which people don't really know about, but may have influenced not just America, but the French Revolution. And this particular development takes place in Ukraine, not far from where current hostilities are happening. In 1710, we see the emergence of something written in Latin and called the Pacta et Constitutiones, written by Hetman Philip Orlik. He was a Cossack, and he developed an idea about, this is an island in the middle of the Dnieper River near Zaporizhia region, so it's right near where the hostilities are. And as Cossacks, he developed this whole constitution about being democratic, provisions against corruption, all sorts of very pioneering ideas which went on to influence both the French and the Americans. And it's in that context that the Americans fought for their independence from British tyranny. 1776 Declaration of Independence, as we know, we hold these truths to be self-evident, etc., etc. So by the people, for the people. And then the Constitution was drafted in 1787 with its famous preamble, we the people of the United States, blah, blah, blah. And I'm deliberately ignoring the French Revolution because that's a more complicated event. And the US Constitution, First Amendment in 1791, protected free speech. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or the right of people to peacefully assemble. And these are still points that people are talking about today. And then in 1823, we have the Monroe Doctrine, when President Monroe established a doctrine of non-interference. 4 basic points. Number 1, the United States would not interfere in the internal affairs or the wars between European powers. Number 2, the United States recognized and would not interfere with existing colonies and dependencies in the Western Hemisphere. Number 3, the Western Hemisphere was closed to future colonization. And number 4, any attempt by European power to oppress or control any nation in the Western Hemisphere would be viewed as a hostile act against the United States. And that should have been that. Leave us alone and we'll leave you alone. That's essentially what the Monroe Doctrine says. So while that may have been the case in the West, that was not what was happening in the East in the 1820s and in China. And what had been happening in the East, in China, Europe had been running a negative trade balance with China since about 1820, because Chinese goods such as porcelain, tea, silk were in demand in Europe, but there was no demand for European goods in China. So the outflow of silver to China led to a shortage of silver currency in Europe, until the British East India Company began smuggling opium from Bengal to China. The Chinese government was opposed to the opium trade and was unable to stop the smugglers. So what happened was that in 1839, there was the first Opium War, which was fought between 1839 and 1842. And that was fought by the British Empire against the Chinese, forcibly opening up the Chinese market for opium traders of basically the clients of the British East India Company. So that's what happened in 1839. And in so essentially the British government completely supports the East India Company with military support. In the summer of 1841, the British conquered several Chinese coastal cities using troops from India. In 1842, China was forced to sign the Treaty of Nanking, requiring them to tolerate British drug trafficking in China. In 1842, there were 416 million Chinese, but only 2 million drug addicts. By 1881, the population had dropped to 370 million, of which nearly a third, 120 million, were dependent on opium. That's what we did to China. And so on the subject of opium, it's not without coincidence or irony that it's not only physical drugs that can destroy minds of people, but ideas too. And in particular, you're probably all familiar with the famous phrase of Karl Marx that religion is the opium of the people. Now, by 1848, his Communist Manifesto was published in London. He moved to London a year later. There are 2 ways to look at Marx. On the one hand, he followed in a political tradition that continued on from the French Revolution in 1789, the word socialism first appearing among French activists in 1830. There was a lot of upheaval, especially in Europe. There was a Chartist movement in England and so on. And on the other hand, you can take the view that there was more to Marx and the motive behind him. For a private citizen, Marx had a remarkable number of contacts with important contemporary political figures. Others have established that he was a third cousin on his mother's side to the Rothschilds, his Dutch Baron Cohen grandmother's cousin having married a Rothschild. Both his parents were Jewish and came from a long line of rabbis. Now, there's a German writer called Wolfgang Waldner. He refers to Marx as being a Prussian government agent. He says his brother-in-law was the Prussian Minister of the Interior, Ferdinand Westphalen. According to Waldner, Marx was useful as a spy into socialist circles. He points out that when Marx and Engels took over the communist ideological leadership, the revolutionaries became peaceful, with value-form analysis employed instead of dynamite. The fight against the anarchists was Marx's main concern in the First International. Those who called for immediate change were vilified and attacked by Marx and Engels as utopian socialists. Instead, what they wanted was scientific socialism, which demonstrated the inevitability of workers' impoverishment, and world revolution is promised as a consolation. It's all rubbish. Furthermore, Waldner refers to Marx's connections to a non-entity known as David Urquhart, who gets to know him in 1853. The significance of Urquhart is that he was strongly anti-Russian and keen to support British interests in attacking Russia. He encouraged Marx in his anti-Russian writing from this point on, and Urquhart may have himself been involved in revolutionary activities in the Caucasus. Marx's willingness to collaborate with Urquhart suggests that there is merit in the second interpretation of his role, and in a wider context, there is no real difference between right and left, that these two labels are just different ways of achieving the same objective, i.e. the globalist imperialists want our return to neo-feudalism. Now, 1853 was an important year in other ways, given that the British were making a direct attack on Russian interests, curious parallel with today, with the outbreak of the Crimean War, whose purpose was, as always, to stop Russia accessing ice-free ports and keep them contained as a land power. Although it wasn't until the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 that the Mediterranean became quite so important to British maritime interests, they still wanted to keep Russia out of the Mediterranean, and still do. Throughout most of the 19th century, as the empire grew in importance to the British played the great game with the green blob to keep Russia out of India. Indeed, it was so critical to keep Russia contained that Britain even agreed with China in 1906 that the British would keep out of Tibet if China agreed to keep Tibet free of foreign influences, i.e. Russian, in effect giving China control over Tibet. That was in 1906, and perhaps paving the way for what happened later. Now, it was during the Crimean War that Tsar Alexander II came to power. This Tsar is placed on the side of freedom, partly because one of his most famous actions in 1861 was the emancipation of the serfs, a giant step for freedom. And it was also in 1861 that the American Civil War breaks out. We might regard the Civil Wars being between North and South, the Unionist North and the Confederate South, the industrialized North and the slave-owning South. The slave-owning South was like an Achilles heel for America. Between 1801 and 1824, more than 100,000 slaves had been directly transported to America, although the majority of the Atlantic slave trade ended up in the Caribbean or South America. In addition, the slave population of slave families kept growing in the southern states of America, increasing the total number of slaves. But the Civil War could also be seen as a proxy war on behalf of British interests, which supported the South partly because Britain benefited from the cotton trade, which came out of those southern states. The British thus had a very real interest in the South winning the Civil War, and may well have succeeded in helping the South win if Tsar Alexander II hadn't taken the action he did. In 1863, he sent the Imperial Russian fleet to the aid of the North, to New York on the East Coast and to San Francisco on the West Coast, which meant that the Union was saved, because it put the British off from wanting to really engage with the Russian Navy. And then in order to contain the British in what was called then the British North America, also known to us as Canada, in 1867, the Tsar sold the land of Alaska to the free Americans because they wanted to keep a lid on Canada. Collaboration between these free Americans and Russia continued as Russia engaged in the process of modernization. This collaboration was most noticeable in the help that the Americans gave Russia in the development of railways. The Trans-Siberian Railway was built with the help of American engineers and with rolling stock from Pennsylvania. So as we near the 20th century in my top notes, the last thing that the British imperialists with this mindset wanted was for a free America to join forces with a modernizing Russia. What the British did not want was that kind of collaboration. Because by the turn of the century, Russia was building railways, industrializing, and from the 1880s onwards, Russia was installing electricity. It wasn't backward, as we're kind of led to believe. A powerful Russia posed a major threat. So looking at this world island, this is what had to happen. Turn America away from Russia back to Britain. And similarly, the British did not want the European heartland in the form of Germany getting too close to Russia, which explains the domino effect behind the events leading to the First World War. First, a Serbian assassinates an Austro-Hungarian in June 1914. Austria declares war on Serbia. It was then obvious that Germany would support the Austrians and the Russians the Serbs, and because France was allied with Russia in August 14, Britain supported France. But to return to the situation before 1914, to the turn of the 20th century, it is possible to identify 6 main goals of the British-based imperialists which continue to resonate today, the main one being the preservation of the empire. So around the turn of the 20th century, the British Empire, as I said earlier, it was vast. 400 million people, nearly a quarter of the global population, were part of this empire. China had another quarter, Russia had about 8% of the global population, the US 4%, French 4%, German 4%, just to give you some context. So in order to achieve the primary goal of preserving the empire, which morphs into globalism and attempts at one world government, around the turn of the century, the main goal was obviously preserving it. The second major goal was to regain America, turn it away from Russia. The next one was to keep control of India, the jewel in the crown. The next one was to keep China weak. I've mentioned the Opium Wars. Between 1899 and 1901, the Boxer rebellions were a further failed attempt by the Chinese to get rid of the British parasite. Another one was to keep Africa colonized, to keep the continent underdeveloped and backward, make it easier to drain it of all resources. And number 6 was to destroy Russia. And so starting with the attempts to regain America, what we find in 1902 is the setting up of the Pilgrim Society, which had the explicit aim of fostering Anglo-American friendship. It still exists today. It helped that the American financier J.P. Morgan and family had retained close ties with London. J.P. Morgan's father, John Junius Morgan, had gone into business with another American, George Peabody, in 1854 in London. And in 1910, J.P. Morgan's London banking activities went on to become the investment bank Morgan Grenfell. Now, people like Lord Alfred Milner, prominent member of the Lloyd George government and imperialist to his core, soon became associated with the Pilgrim Society. He is known for the Round Table movement, which was founded in 1909, which had as its objective uniting colonies into some kind of world government. Cecil Rhodes was another close associate who helped to fund the Round Tables. He's, of course, famous for plundering Africa, and something which continues today. No problem with appropriate technology, i.e. solar panels, using cobalt from the Congo and that kind of thing. Now, while the association between Rhodes and Africa is well known, you may be less familiar with the thinking behind another Rhodes legacy, i.e. the Rhodes Scholarship. These were set up in Oxford in 1903. Rhodes himself had died in 1902, but he left money in trust for the scholarships. In 1877, in a confession of faith that he wrote, he gave an indication of how he saw these scholarships. He talked of setting up a kind of society, a church, for the extension of the British Empire, a society which should have members in every part of the empire, working with one object and one idea. We should have its members placed at our universities and our schools, and should watch the English youth passing through their hands. This is the key word, watch. And he went on to write, just one perhaps in every 1,000 would have the mind and feelings for such an object. He should be tried in every way. He should be tested and disregardful of the petty details of life. And if he's found to be such, elected and bound by oath to serve for the rest of his life in his country. Thus, over the years, the scholarships have continued to be a useful filter for talent spotting, and examples of those who've been chosen through this route include the former US President Bill Clinton. Now, Rhodes, in the same document, he also talks of creating secret societies which would be helpful in furthering the aims of the empire. And if you should be any doubt, he speaks of more of the Anglo-Saxon race, more of the best, the most human, most honourable race the world possesses. That's the kind of man that he is. But what may surprise you then is how much Rhodes and his associates had in common with the founders of this body that promoted socialism in 1884. And this is what Bob has just been talking about, the Fabian Society. Now, it describes itself as Britain's oldest political think tank. Its name, as Bob was saying, its name comes from the Roman general Quintus Fabius, who preferred to wait until the right moment to strike during the Punic Wars. And it's intended to indicate preference, as Bob was saying, for gradual transformation rather than revolution. And early members of the Fabian Society were also among those who founded the LSE in 1895. In this photograph, from left to right, we have Beatrice and Sidney Webb with Bernard Shaw on the left. I think you'll be shocked by what all these people had in common with Rhodes and others. For a start, many Fabians were enthusiastic supporters of the empire. Under the influence of Sidney Webb and George Bernard Shaw, they rejected the idea that Britain must educate subject peoples towards self-government. They rejected that and advanced an intellectual justification for autocratic control in the dependent empire. So far as the empire was concerned, Webb and Shaw aimed less at reconstructing political institutions than at making existing institutions work more effectively. So in its Fabian metamorphosis, the utilitarian idea of empire thus displayed a zeal for order and civilization, and its dominant theme was greater efficiency. They regarded the empire as a vehicle for one world socialist government, and Shaw considered the British Empire the closest to the ideal for an international authority and an essential part of the evolutionary process. And if that isn't shocking enough, their views on eugenics should leave you speechless. George Bernard Shaw could write, "The only fundamental possible socialism is the socialization of the selective breeding of man." Later he mused that the overthrow of the aristocrat has created the necessity for the superman. As someone wrote in 2019, from the beginning, socialism regarded itself as the natural ally, even the political version of science. Just as biologists sought to understand animals and plants, so scientific socialism would master people. They were very inspired by Darwin and a Darwinian commitment to improving the quality of the nation's genetic stock. Many progressives were drawn to the hope that science could build up the strong parts of the nation and slowly eliminate the weak, and they willingly joined the Eugenics Society. No difference between left and right in terms of goals. Anyway, back to London and the beginning of the 20th century. Curiously, in 1902, these characters appear. London is where they first meet. On the left is Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, known as Vladimir Lenin, and on the right is Lev Davidovich Bronstein, better known as Leon Trotsky. Between 1902 and 1911, Lenin paid 6 visits to London. His visit in 1905 is particularly key, and this man is potentially the linchpin. He's called Philip Whitwell Wilson. Whitwell Wilson was a writer and a journalist. He wrote numbers of books, and then after a while he fades from view. But in the early part of the 20th century, he was publicly active. In 1906, he became a Liberal Party MP. The Liberal Party at that time was quite a different thing. Winston Churchill was a member of the Liberal Party at that time. In 1909, Whitwell Wilson was part of the first ever Imperial Press Conferences, which was organised by many of the same people behind the Pilgrim Society, such as Lord Alfred Milner. Wilson is described as a prime mover of this 1909 conference, so presumably he considered himself to be one of them, sharing their belief in the importance of empire and how supporting Bolsheviks might actually be in the interests of empire. After all, others were of that opinion, especially in certain Anglo-American circles. It is known, for example, that Trotsky spent 4 months being looked after by Wall Street financiers in New York in 1917. There is a view that Trotsky was the financier's choice to lead Russia after the revolution. And there were also big Western money being behind the Bolshevik Revolution. There was a bizarre American Red Cross mission to Russia in 1917 after the revolution, which was led by US magnate William Boyce Thompson. The majority of the mission was made up of lawyers, financiers, and their assistants, not really any doctors, even though it was a Red Cross mission. And so the money flowed. And I think Putin knows well that Russia was invaded in 1917. So is it just a coincidence that in 1905, this is where Lenin stayed in London? 16 Percy Circus in the King's Cross area, the home of Philip Whitwell Wilson. Now, from the perspective of the British Empire, it could be said that by 1919, the goals that had been set 20 years or so earlier mission accomplished, as what had happened in 1917, Russia was destroyed, at least for the time being. Clearly what took place between 1914 also made any rapprochement between Germany and Russia impossible. And so 1917 was also the time of the Balfour Declaration. I'm going to mention that a bit later. The success of these British imperialists wanting to regain America is evident in the willingness of US President Woodrow Wilson to abandon the Monroe Doctrine and entered the war on the side of Britain in 1917. This was the public beginning of the special relationship involving British brains and American brawn to help Britain preserve the empire in one form or another. In 1919, India was still very much part of the empire. China was still weak, although interestingly, plans may have been being made for China to get the Bolshevik treatment as early as 1919, as that is when American University, Yale, had an outpost in China which helped the young Mao with his Marxist studies. And we all know what happened in China 40 years later when they got the Bolshevik treatment. And Africa remained backward and colonized. The First World War, however, is of interest not just because of the harsh globalist methods that physically killed millions of people, because it is during this time that there were significant experiments in psychology to create mass brainwashing, most notably with the help of Sigmund Freud's nephew, Edward Bernays, who worked closely with Britain's War Propaganda Bureau based in Wellington House near Buckingham Palace, with the owners of tabloid newspapers who were present at those meetings. Bernays even published a book in 1928 called Propaganda. He went on to become the father of American advertising industry. So when he worked during the World War I with the Propaganda Bureau, tricks like your country needs you, find ways of persuading hordes of young British men to sign up to die without really knowing why. And that's when the tabloids become established, papers which developed a technique of presenting opinion as if it were fact. And then, of course, it's after World War I that the globalists had their first attempt at world government with the League of Nations in 1919, which pushed for the dissolution of the nation state, blaming nationalism for the calamity that had befallen Europe. But others saw through this. They realized it was a thin disguise to allow the British Empire to continue by other means. And the next iteration of the international body, which occurred after the Second World War, 1945, the United Nations, was more careful to confirm the principle of sovereign equality of members in Article 2. I'm not going to go into the 1930s. We all know what happened then. But the imperialists needed to adopt different strategies to achieve their objectives. Bernays had shown the way with mind manipulation, and he continued to work with a version of the Tavistock Clinic that existed between the wars, and then after World War II, when it became the Tavistock Institute, this time in a new location. It was also after World War II that the LSE attracted a young Hungarian refugee by the name of George Soros, who arrived in London in 1947. And then you'll never guess who was sent to the Tavistock Institute from America in 1952, a young Henry Kissinger. And we all know it was in the 1960s that Kissinger became increasingly involved in America's handling of the Vietnam War. And he worked with the State Department from 68 to 73. This is the same Kissinger who worked on opening up China from 71 as a slave factory destination for US manufacturing, so it could be offshore, the deindustrialization of America. And in his 1974 National Security Study Memorandum 200, he made it clear that US foreign policy should be linked to population control. And just in case you were in any doubt about his true allegiance, in a 1982 speech at Chatham House, he admitted, "In my White House incarnation as National Security Advisor, I kept the British Foreign Office better informed and more closely engaged than I did the American State Department." Now, the 1960s were at that time, partly as a way to divert American anti-Vietnam War protests, the Tavistock Institute and its American allies went into full brainwashing mode on both sides of the pond. LSD and other drugs became popular, turn on, tune in, drop out. Afghanistan was get control of the opium poppy trade. The drugs thing, as we know, has been a very key thing. A whole cult culture was developed in the 1960s, especially through music, with groups like Grateful Dead being an example of direct creation of the CIA. appropriate for a doom cult. And the photograph of this man here is Theodore Adorno, who's known to have been the musical brains behind the Beatles. Even music charts were a deliberate way to get us hooked. And in case we weren't sufficiently brainwashed or stoned by the end of the 60s, the doom cult decided they needed a more academic front to justify doomsterism and a way to slow down, even reverse, human industrial progress. So in 1968, they set up the Club of Rome, which in 1972 published the famous Neo-Malthusian Limits to Growth, People Are the Problem. By the end of the 1970s, the Chinese had fallen for this propaganda, and they implemented their inhumane one-child policy, which meant that millions of baby girls disappeared. That policy was reversed in 2016. Now, one of the key members of this doom club was, as Sandi pointed out, the Canadian Maurice Strong, who in 1972 set up the UN Environmental Programme. And the early 1970s were also when the World Economic Forum was started by Klaus Schwab. And he acknowledges both Maurice Strong and Henry Kissinger as his mentors. He spent time at Harvard in '67 where he encountered Henry Kissinger. And so, as we know, the World Economic Forum is famous for its stakeholder capitalism, what we might call fascism. And it became famous for telling everyone in 2016 that we'll own nothing and be happy. And it wants to be known for its industrial revolution. And it, as Sandi pointed out, the Event 201, and there's no doubt in my mind that the World Economic Forum has a coordinating role in this attempt to terraform our futures. So back to the 1970s, without going into the detail of the history of the the environmental movement, there was basically the coup at the Rio Earth Summit that Sandi's gone into in detail in 1992. It's at that point we get Agenda 21 opening the way for ESGs. So now they use protection of the planet as the excuse for preventing development in Africa. In his book Apocalypse Never, Michael Schellenberger, the American independent researcher, he recounts how he came across a Californian-based NGO called International Rivers, and what they claim to have done is to have stopped 217 dams, which may sound great, but these were mostly in poorer nations. And was that always with the support of the locals? Schellenberger found a contrary opinion among locals in Africa when he interviewed them. He said they wanted the hydroelectric dams, and he thinks it no coincidence that these Californian activists are keen on whitewater rafting, which the dams would get in the way of. And it isn't just poorer nations that are prevented from developing, but First Nations people too. Members of the Navajo Nation in America are currently not happy that the US government is blocking them from benefiting from oil drilling in the Chaco Canyon area because the government has created a buffer zone to keep out drilling. The 25th Navajo Nation wishes to support the Navajo Nation members who hold allotted land in the area around Chaco Canyon, and they want to allow those members to maximize their economic interests. They do not support the buffer zone around Chaco Canyon, but we don't get to hear about that. They voted against it in April 2023 because they don't want poverty, and why should they? Back to the 1990s, a year after Rio, in 1993, George Soros launches his Open Society Foundation's branch in the USA. The year before, in 1992, Soros had been revealed as the one who broke the Bank of England. But there are many who actually think that that was a sort of bit of a setup. He was praised as a hero by Lord William Rees-Mogg, who was the editor of the London Times, but that was all very suspicious. He'd already been active in starting foundations behind the Iron Curtain in Hungary and other parts of Eastern Europe, and his foundations, as we know, have been implicated in all kinds of regime change operations around the world. Works closely in tandem with the CIA-funded outfit known as the National Endowment for Democracy, which Reagan had launched in London in 1982. So internally in the USA, it is clear that Soros's objective has always been to undermine US society from within by supporting things like BLM. And in recent times, Soros has also hit on the wheeze of funding direct district attorneys in various states around the US, because there they have to stand for election. So he's put money towards their election expenses. It is reckoned that he has spent over $40 million in the last 10 years on 75 district attorneys in different states, covering nearly half of the US's most populated cities. I got this all from a particular report. And what they say is that what's striking about these prosecutors that Soros funds is they have no previous criminal experience. They can be relied upon for social justice sentencing, and the result is a rise in crime and violence that follows their appointments in those areas. Now, Soros had named his organisation Open Society in acknowledgement of the work of this famous philosopher, Karl Popper, who had moved to London in 1946 and taught at the LSE when Soros was a student there. Popper's book, The Open Society and Its Enemies, had been published in London in 1945. And I have to confess that I had misunderstood this book. I had understood it being in favour of open democratic society as opposed to closed totalitarian regimes. But as some Canadian patriot has written, by open, they don't mean a society that is pluralistic, open to different viewpoints. They mean a Western world that hates its European national identity, is totally open to mass immigration and non-white identity politics, yet closed to whites who care about their national heritage. Popper and Soros both equate nationalism with tribalism. Popper himself stated that nationalism appeals to our tribal instincts. In other words, globalism is modern, progressive, and scientific. Nationalism is something from the past to be rejected. Now, I should point out here that I'm not endorsing any kind of anti-immigration stand. I'm all in favour of immigration that is legal. There is a difference. America is an amazing tribute to being a melting pot of different ethnicities who can unite behind the concept of one nation. My point is more about nationalism and the way that it unites people, something which the globalists do not want. Now, one individual who very much agrees with this way of thinking is about nationalism to be something to be rejected is our very own doom cultist, Sir Anthony Charles Linton Blair, known to us as Tony Blair, former MP. From a March 2004 BBC website, it said, "Now Mr. Blair wants to take the process further. International terrorism post-11th September and the spread of weapons of mass destruction require further redefinition of the rights of a nation-state," he argued in a speech. He even mentioned the Treaty of Westphalia from 1648 that basically ended the religious wars in Europe and began the modern system of the nation-state, whose rights, he suggested, should be further curtailed. Funny that. Tony Blair, in fact, first mentioned his doctrine of international community in a speech in Chicago in 1999 at the time of the Kosovo War. So to summarize, these have been their objectives. Given all the mind-warping, manoeuvring going on, do we find ourselves in a similar place as we were over 100 years ago? With the blowing up of the Nord Stream pipeline in September 2022, is this the picture we're faced with? No different in some respects to 1914. Now, before I explain the differences with 1914, I just want to briefly return to this slide, and in particular focus on this person, Leon Trotsky, and what else was going on during World War I, also in 1917, in addition to the Russian October Revolution, because this all has relevance to what is happening in Gaza today. It is relevant that Trotsky was Jewish, and no coincidence that in November 1917, Lord Balfour wrote his famous declaration/letter, indicating the British government's support for Zionists and a Jewish homeland. I'm not suggesting for a moment that the imperialist globalists created Zionism. That was already a movement alive in the 19th century. There was a tiny Jewish minority living in Palestine under the Ottoman Empire. What I'm suggesting is that Jewish Zionism could only really flourish and begin the process that led to the State of Israel because it suited the interests of the imperialist globalists. Without their support, it is unlikely, in my view, that the State of Israel would have happened in 1948. The British had already agreed the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement in 1916, which gave them control over Palestine. It was called the British Mandate for Palestine. It was going to be in their sphere of influence anyway with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. The British encouraged Zionism to suit their own agenda, but that did not make them pro-Jewish. Quite the contrary. For a start, I have explained how the globalists covertly used communism to destroy Russia from within. And just as they cynically used Russian communists, so did they also... 5 minutes. Okay, I'll do my best. They cynically used Russian communists, so did they also use Russian Jewish communists like Trotsky. By 1920, the Doom cult were quite prepared to spread the notion that there was a Jewish plot to take over the world, especially once this publication appeared in 1920. It was a hoax known as the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And Churchill wrote about a global conspiracy. In 1920, he wrote a key article talking about a Jewish conspiracy to take over the world. So 1 minute, an attack on George Soros is anti-Semitic. Next minute, he's being attacked for pro-Palestinian funding. They're just all over the place. Their narrative is completely falling apart. We got the doom gobbling Greta Thunberg herself supporting Hamas, and Justin Castro in Canada. They no longer make any sense. And even ESGs. Linda Forrester Rothschild said in the summer, in August 2023, that they're trying to abandon ESGs and move to inclusive capitalism. So we can take heart. The doom cult is definitely in demise. The tectonic plates have dramatically moved. And it's no coincidence that Hezbollah has not so far invaded Israel. They're waiting. They know it was a trap to pull them in. And it's failed in other ways. The principle of the Treaty of Westphalia still holds, 1945 still hold, and there are certain other political and economic realities. They cannot ignore the reality of the BRICS. The BRICS in 2023, they overtook the G7 in terms of share of global GDP. Russia, the most sanctioned country in the world, has a bigger economy than Germany. It's got richer. It's all falling apart. It really is not working. And also things like the greening of the earth, this paper that was published in 2016, they looked at the leaf area index, and what they found is that over India and China, there's even more green. More, not less. So a side note, James Delingpole may have despaired that no one took notice of ClimateGate when the story broke in November 2009. It's not quite true. India and China took note that fraud was involved. And as a result, at the COP15 climate summit in Copenhagen, the Indians and the Chinese ensured that it was watered down with no binding targets. So why exactly are we stuck with net zero? Well, we can shiver. They can't stop the World Wide Web. They've lost control of that. And so it matters what happens in America. In 1776, they had a legal framework for fighting for freedom, which is what we lack in Britain, because all we want is world peace, with all the nations collaborating on their own terms, not just BRICS, for the poorest countries to use their own resources for their own development, even if that means that whitewater rafting isn't quite as easy. And above all, we want the evil empire to disintegrate and acquiesce so we can all live in peace and freedom. There you go.